Okay, today's lesson is on factoring what we call trinomials, 1, 2, 3. That's where the trinomial comes from. We're going to factor these just like we factored out the greatest common factor on Friday. Remember that factoring means to get it into kind of a simpler form. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so first of all, we have to review something from Algebra 1. If you look at this problem here, to multiply these together, what you do, we can do something called FOIL, F-O-I-L. The F stands for the firsts, so you would multiply x times x. And really, this is just the distributive property is all it is. FOIL is just a way for you to remember it. So if I multiply x times x, I get x squared. O stands for the outsides. I'm going to multiply the things on the outsides next. And again, this is just the distributive property. X times 3 is 3x, so it would be plus 3x. Then the I stands for the insides, and here's your acronym FOIL right there. First, outsides, insides, last. All right, so now if I multiply the insides, 2 times x is 2x, so I have plus 2x. The L stands for lasts, so I'm going to multiply the last numbers. 2 times 3 is 6. So I get x squared plus 3x plus 2x plus 6. But if you notice, I can add 3x and 2x together, and that gives me 5x. So really, this is x squared plus 5x plus 6. And that's what I get when I multiply x plus 2 times x plus 3. I get this. Okay, let's do number 2 now. Number 2 is r plus 5 times r minus 9. We're going to use that same FOIL acronym to help us remember what order to do things in. F stands for the first terms. We're going to multiply the r times the r, and we get r squared. O stands for outside. R times negative 9 would be negative 9r. The I stands for inside, so 5 times r is 5r. And L stands for the last terms. 5 times negative 9 is negative 45. And once again, if you notice, the two middle terms can be put together. Negative 9r and 5r together make negative 4r, so this would be r squared minus 4r minus 45. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to take these things and put them back into this form, because this form is really helpful when doing things with quadratic equations, which is what we're going to be studying next. This is called factoring. It's undoing the distributive property. So we're going to take this and go back here, and you might be thinking, there's no way I can ever do that. I don't understand how I would do that. Well, I'm going to show you, and it's really, really easy. I'm also going to take this one and put it back in this form, okay? In order to do this, you have to understand where that number comes from and where that number comes from. The x squared you just get from multiplying the x times the x. So we know that the first two terms in our parentheses are going to be x and x, okay? The 5 comes from, let's look at these other two numbers here, 2 and 3. What could I do to those to make them a 5? Okay, I could add them together. That's exactly what I do. Let's look over here. We know that the r times the r is the r squared, but the negative 4r, that term in the middle, if you take these two numbers, positive 5 and negative 9, and you add them together, you get negative 4, and then you put an r on the end of it. And that's how you get that middle term. Okay, now let's look at the last term, the 6. If I take these two numbers and I multiply them together, I get 6. If I take these two numbers, 5 times negative 9, and I multiply them together, I get negative 45. And that's how we do it. And so all we have to do is when we look at this and we want to factor it, or we look at this and we want to factor it, we need to figure out what adds up to this middle term but multiplies to this term, and that's going to give us our two numbers in our parentheses. The x and the x are going to be the first numbers, and then the second two numbers are going to be what adds to the middle term and what multiplies to the third term. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to factor quadratic trinomials of the form x squared plus bx plus c. Sometimes polynomials do not have a greatest common factor. That's what we did on Friday. We figured out if they had things in common. If you look at something like this, those three terms have nothing in common, so we can't factor out a greatest common factor. But we can factor this into this form back up here. Okay, in such cases, we must use other methods to factor them. We will concentrate on factoring trinomials, and trinomials are polynomials with three terms. That's where they get the name trinomials. Remember, factoring means to find what multiplies to make a product, in this case, the trinomial. You can always check your answer by multiplying the factors to make sure they make the original trinomial. So what we're talking about there is if I have this and I want to factor it and I get this, to check my answer to see if I did it right, I can multiply it back together and I should get this when I'm done. These two things should be equal to each other. Okay. All right, let's look at the bottom of this page. It says here, we have been factoring for a while now using the brain teaser puzzles. You just didn't know it. That's exactly what those brain teasers were for. They were teaching us how to find out what what adds to make that middle term and what multiplies to make this last term. So if I want to factor this, we're going to just do a brain teaser puzzle. The adding part goes up here, so that middle term, that's what adds to make that. That's going to go here. The part that multiplies is going to go down here, the last term. So I'm just looking for two numbers that add up to 13 and multiply to 30. And like I said, we've been doing this when we do the brain teaser puzzle. Can you figure out what adds up to 13 and what multiplies to make 30? I bet you can really easily. If you can, go ahead and fill these two in. Okay, I get 10 and 3. If you put 3 and 10, that's fine. 10 plus 3 is 13. 10 times 3 is 30. You can always check it that way. Okay, so how does this help us factor this? Well, the factored form of a trinomial is going to look like this. It's going to be a binomial times a binomial. That's a binomial because there's two terms. And that's a binomial because there's two terms. So it's going to be something in parentheses times something in parentheses. So what I'm going to do is I am going to set this up. I'm going to do two sets of parentheses. Sorry about that. The first term in those two sets of parentheses have to multiply to make x squared, so it will be x and x. All right, now we just have to figure out what those second terms are. Well, these are the second terms, 10 and 3. And it's a positive 10 and a positive 3, so it's plus 10 and plus 3. And I just factored this. And if you do the FOIL thing, you're going to get x squared plus 3x plus 10x plus 30, which is x squared plus 13x plus 30. This equals that. This is the factored form of that, and so this would be what I'd be looking for. That's my answer. Okay, let's go on to number 2. We have x squared plus 11x plus 28. All right, so remember the middle term is going to go here. The last term is going to go down here. I want two numbers that add to 11 but multiply to 28. If you're having trouble figuring out what they are, you can always list the factors of 28, like I know 1 times 28, 2 times 14, 4 times 7. That's the only way to get 28. Which one of those add up to 11? Obviously 4 and 7. So those two numbers must be 4 and 7. And you can check it. 4 plus 7 is 11. 4 times 7 is 28. That's right. So then all I have to do now is put those numbers into factored form. To get x squared, I have to multiply x times x. So those are my first two terms. And then I have a positive 4 and a positive 7 there. Plus 4 plus 7. And I just factored that. And that's it. Okay, let's turn your paper over. Okay, let's do number 3. We have x squared plus 16x plus 48, and I want to know what the factors are. In other words, what multiplies to make that? Well, if I do the brain teaser puzzle, that 16 is going to go there, that 48 is going to go there. What adds up to 16 and multiplies to make 48? Think about that for a minute. You can certainly pause the video while you think about it. and put those numbers in there. If you need to, list out the factors of 48. I know it's 1 times 48, 2 times 24, 3 times, let's see, 16, 4 times 12, and 6 times 8. Those are the things that multiply to make 48. Which ones of those add up to 16? Looks to me like it would be 4 and 12. So that's got to be a 4 and that's got to be a 12. So when I do my factors, the first term has to be x squared. So I know that the first part in each set of parentheses is x and x.